My name is Jacob Daniel. I'm fellow with the Kirkwood Center for Ethics and Theology, where we are committed to equipping the church through cultural apologetics, theology, philosophy, law, politics. And it's my honor today to be here with two of my dear friends, Harry Edwards and Logan Sepieri. Harry is also a fellow with the Kirkwood Center for Ethics and Theology, and also Logan is the secretary of the organization. But before I introduce them, today we're going to have an interesting topic to talk about. We want to discuss church engagement with nations. What does mission mean to us today? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the things that we need to be careful about in the context in which we live today? So we're going to look into some of the questions. We're going to look into whether traditional methods and strategies are still effective in missions. What about the growing perception that we're seeing around the world, especially in the Eastern world and in Africa, where people are seeing it through the lens of historical narrative, and they're talking about how to see missions through the lens of historical colonialism that they've gone through. And the third thing that we're going to look into is how to rethink global missions in terms of our current need here in the Western world itself, in our own nation. And to explore these questions, as I mentioned, I have two of my good friends here. Dr. Harry Edwards, how are you doing today?
Pretty good, Jacob. Thanks for having me on the show.
And
My first time, and I'm not used to being interviewed. As you know.
yes, and we want to thank you for this location as well that you opened for us to get together and to do this podcast. Thank you very much. Logan, how are you doing?
Doing well, busy, but politics is fun, as it is right now.
Now, missions have always faced resistance wherever it's been taken, by missionaries. It has always faced some kind of opposition. People have questioned. It's always seen as something external from outside. And not only that, missions have experienced or gone through some historical experiences of nations. Particularly, one of the objections that's raised against missions today is that it has been a product, or it has been a collaborator with the whole neo-colonialist idea. So there's a shift in missions with regards to how it used to be under an empire framework. But today what we have is a nation framework. There are nations around the world. So we're going to talk about how mission should look like in the current context. But before we do that, Harry, you were recently in the Philippines. You took one of the teams from your church there. Can you share a little bit of your experience that's been there and your observation? What are some of the trends that you're seeing in missions?
Yes, thanks for that question, Jacob. So I led a team. There were 10 of us. We went to the Philippines mid-January to late January, so about 10 days. And obviously it was transformative, not only in us sharing the gospel, but also how it impacted a lot of my team members, including myself. Why did we choose the Philippines? For obvious reasons. At least I'm Filipino. I've been there. I grew up there. I know the language. I know the culture. And it seemed like the thing to do, like as part of our Christian walk, Also, which I'm sure we're going to discuss this in our conversation this afternoon, but it's one of the poorest nations in the world. And I had this thinking that Christianity, wherever it blooms, also prospers economically. So that's an interesting thing. Why hasn't it prospered, or why hasn't the Philippines prospered as it should? Now, because maybe in a general sense, it is a Christian nation, but technically, really, it's a Roman Catholic nation. There's a big difference there, but more on that later. So it was good. We ministered to a lot of the poverty-stricken areas, and what was interesting in this particular trip, we were able to help 3 churches. One literally is the biggest, the mega church in the Philippines. One would be, I'd say, your average size church, maybe 400 members, and one was a small church, like maybe 50 or 60 people meeting in someone's garage. So the team experienced all sorts of facets of church life in the Philippines in those 10 days.
Do people still tend to see it positively? Are you seeing any kind of positive trends there or some negative?
Well, for sure. See, in the Philippines, unlike, let's say, even the predominant feeling here, Western people are loved there. They really are. So there's no neo-colonialism mentality that goes on. There's no negative feelings towards foreigners. They genuinely love foreigners, especially English speaking, especially Americans. So again, you might see factions of what you're going to refer to as neo-colonialism efforts by the white folks, maybe in the colleges, maybe just, but that'd be a small minority. You don't see them in the media. And so in a very positive sense, Americans are loved there, no doubt.
Logan, what's your sense? What has led to this kind of idea that missions or missionaries were agents of the West, bringing in the Western influence over these nations?
Yeah, so I would say there's a few things, at least two things. The first one is perhaps maybe how we've come to understand it through our academics or maybe through the political discourse. And the second one would be maybe some of the more assumptions that have gone into it. Now, what I mean by the first one is very often when you interact with people of different cultures, they think that when, say, someone from the US or someone maybe more broadly from the Western culture interacts with someone from an Eastern culture, it's Asia. Philippines is a little difficult because they've been under the sort of US umbrella for a very long time, back to World War II and so on and so forth. But say if it was like a Middle Eastern culture or, maybe something more like maybe Japan or China, they look at it as, oh, what is being imported is something substantively different and unique to the Western mind as it comes into contact with the Eastern mind, however that may be. Something a little more substantive. So that would be more like the academic. The substantive part, though, is there's sort of been this assumption that's rolled into the concept of colonialism, which is that moral values are unique to particular cultures and countries. So when you have for example, a famous, maybe you had brought it beforehand, I brought it up, but there's that famous quote from when England was over India, and they were talking about the sort of the killing of the wife when the husband dies. And they said, yes, according to our culture, we do that. And they told the British, and the British said, well, according to our culture, we kill those people. We do that. The question that colonialism presupposes that they're equal moral values, they have equal weight, and essentially it comes down to who has might gets to decide what moral value stands. But Christianity, and that's why I push back against the whole colonialism idea, is if you drop the moral relativism concept, colonialism no longer makes sense as an ideal. This is where you get sort of more like an enlightened idea or an enlightened morality. There is morality that's wrong.
Yeah.
Values. If the Aztecs were sacrificing people and the Spanish came in and said, we're no longer doing that, you have two interpretations. The colonial, which is Westerners don't do that. They're now telling the Aztecs don't do that. The Spanish have the guns, so they win. Another view of the same situation is, well, actually what is happening is one is claiming a fundamental morality that they believe is right, and they also have the might to enforce it. And I think it's the second aspect that we need to push more strongly, I guess, that we're not talking about particularized morality that is equal between cultures. There's not a, so to speak, Western morality. There might be Western customs,
Yeah.
but we're not talking about morality. Whether or not there are innocent people and whether or not killing those innocent people is okay or not are these moral values, and they are universal.
Basically, the idea is that how can people who are involved in missions can translate the gospel in the culture itself,
Yes.
without diluting the morality that it brings with it,
Yes,
which is
exactly.
universal in nature.
Yes. If you go to Japan, there's a question of theft,
Yeah.
right? And you may have a disagreement on what theft may be, but I do believe that fundamentally you could identify theft and say that's no longer appropriate, and Japan understands that. Now, the way in which the laws are enforced, what consequences may result from certain kinds of it, like what constitutes a misdemeanor, what constitutes a felony, and how that comes out, that may be a little bit more up to debate depending on custom.
Yeah. So if I may ask, so we talk about gospel proclamation. The trend that I'm seeing in missions usually is one of taking the gospel, the message of the gospel, and leaving it with people for them to actually accept that within their culture. Is it only that, or is it something beyond just proclaiming the gospel? What I mean is that how do we understand that in light of the fact that we are called to disciple the nation? Is it merely sharing the message of the gospel, or does it need to be translated into the culture itself? And cultures need to be transformed as well.
I'm going to start with that. I know Matthew 28, right? It's famous for the Great Commission.
Yeah.
Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. So now, therefore, go into all nations, making disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And I will be with you till the end of the age, right? So that's where we get the Great Commission. And in some of the Gospels, it does talk about proclaiming that gospel to the nations. It's interesting. I don't know exactly where, you might know, when the focus became on saving souls. And some of our good friends would mention that, how evangelicals today have been really good about saving souls, and then we've lost the nation. Right? So at least I know in the ESV translation and other reputable translations, it is nations, right? The Greek says ethne, which is plural of nations. The way I understand it, they could have said, it's all about saving people or saving souls. But when you say saving nations, that's implied already, that obviously you will be saving souls. And of course, God does the saving. But the way and even I believe in Luke, it talks about like redeeming nations or something like that, to that effect. The way I see that, which is missed by the church today, is it's more than just saving souls. I believe that includes institutions, that includes government, that includes local municipalities. I believe that we should be thinking along those lines. That's number one. Number two, the missiologist Ralph Winter did emphasize, I think in one of the conferences back in the 90s, he wrote this paper, and I think churches followed his lead. I think he's right on that, in that we should understand nations as people groups. So as you know, right, like a people group is not just like, let's say, the nation of the Philippines or the nation of Korea, but it's a large grouping of people that share common customs and language and just a way of living. So let's say in the Philippines, there are actually different dialects, and there's different ways that people behave and act. So those would be people groups.
Nation is basically a collection of people groups.
There you go. That's a good way of putting it.
Right. So I think just with regards to missions, focusing merely on people groups based on language would do more disservice than good, in terms of, if we are only focusing on a certain people group based on language, then we may not be entertaining the questions of politics, law, transforming the laws of the land, transforming the educational system of the land. So I think if we look at the early missionaries, including William Carey, who came to India, he came in, he was not merely trying to reach one people group with the missions. What he was doing was looking at the whole collection of people groups in a region, giving them certain boundaries within which they would exist, and transforming the laws, transforming some of the ways in which people understood certain cultural values and things like that, getting involved in politics, getting involved in setting up institutions. So I think that shift needs to happen. The idea of proclamation to a specific people group on the basis of their language alone, I think it is very limiting when it comes to missions.
But would you say that would be a better move toward discipling the nations than let's just say, in our common language in the church, witnessing it down the street? I mean that's good too.
Yeah.
But that's not exactly what Jesus said in Matthew 28, right?
Yes.
But that includes that as well. But I think the church has lost that impetus of focusing on nations.
Correct, exactly. And I think transformation would be always bottom up. But I think it's not either or. We do talk about this quite
Yeah.
often. And churches need to also focus on the fact that much of what we do or public behavior is also informed in terms of certain laws that comes from top down. It translates into people. So transformation is not either or, but I think both, top down as well as bottom up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to go to this sort of like the initial question was like proclamation of the gospel. And
Yeah.
what you have to ask is, what is the gospel? Like, oh, it's the good news. But like good news of what? And right when you get to that point, you already are now having to distinguish between custom and morality, right? Because we think it's the good news that you can save from your sins, which is something concerning people.
Yeah.
And so you have to be able to have that distinction between what constitutes morality and what constitutes custom. And so the church cannot fall victim to the colonialism concept because the colonial concept fuses morality with custom. It's the same thing. Morality is a custom.
Yeah.
And when that custom overtakes another custom, that is the sort of imperialism of colonialism, so the knife's edge, so to speak. And I think where churches have fallen, failed to maintain, probably a better way, is that distinction where the gospel no longer has any important relevance because they don't have a strong understanding of what constitutes morality and what constitutes custom. You have to be able to navigate that. Laws are a perfect example because laws inherently need to be able to distinguish between custom and morality. And in some cases, they pass laws to stop certain customs because those customs are a violation of morality. And so that's
if I'm hearing you correctly, are you actually making a sharp distinction between morality and customs? Because could you have morality within customs?
you have to have at least a core. There has to be something that says someone is or is not innocent. Right, of course, right? Do you wear your, an idea of like a mudroom, right? You take your shoes off before you go in the house. This would be a custom, right?
Yeah.
Now, maybe the custom comes about for some moral things like you're damaging people's property or so there, it can be entangled in some way.
Right. Okay.
There may be certain situations where custom has come about to maybe symbolize or represent some sort of like honor or how you pay respects to someone might be different in the United States. I mean, the perfect example to go with politics is there was an interesting exchange, without getting into all the finer details, where you had Zelensky coming in that White House debate, and you had him, Trump, advancing, "You have not apologized." Now, this might be an interesting custom that is very much fused with morality, and that is when
he's not wearing a suit.
or not wearing a suit, right? So in the report's like, "Where is your suit?"
Right.
And some people will go, "Oh, that's just a custom. That's just a custom." Like, well, it could be just a custom. It could also be a custom that is supposed to be reinforcing some sort of morality. That maybe there is, we don't disagree that there should be some sort of honor in between leaders. We might disagree with what that may look like, but yeah. So is there a sharp distinction? There has to be a distinction, and now how that is sort of lived out might be a little bit more complicated. But you do have to start off with a very clear morality.
Yeah.
Because with a clear morality, you can then understand, okay, is this custom something that needs to go? Or is this some custom that can, in fact, has some form of legitimacy?
The reason why I asked that question is because I don't think a people group can be obviously devoid of either one, right? But the way I see it, seems like a lot of morality is imbued in a custom. So
It gets
the
expressed.
custom, yeah,
It gets
the
expressed.
custom is the bigger thing. The morality is encased in that custom, even though we can make a distinction and we can definitely pull it apart, like in some of the examples you gave, right? Where honor and respect, let's say in an Asian culture, that's a big part of their customs, but that's also a biblical part of who we should be. We should give honor to honor's due, respect, and all that. So in that sense, that would be a good thing to maintain. Any culture that has both a high value of respect and honor in their customs, then we can say that's a good cultural element to maintain.
Yeah, I may have an example connected to what you are saying. a question to be asked is that why has modern mission failed in India? We are 1.5 billion people, and hardly 2.3% of the population is claiming to be a Christian. Why? There is a connection all the way to St. Thomas. Some people make that connection. But in terms of modern missions, I think this is what has happened in the Indian case. There are customs that reflect respect and all that's there. At the same time, there's a hierarchy that already exists. Indian society is so stratified based on caste and languages and cultures. So when missionaries went in, they made some basic assumptions with regards to human dignity. They went in from a Christian perspective with this built-in idea that we all are created equal, right, in the image of God. So we have equal worth and intrinsic values. They went in bringing the gospel, the message of the gospel, to a people who were so divided. They had inherited that, right? It's been deep in the culture, in the customs and everything. They went in. When all the while missionaries were talking about equal dignity, they were thinking about respect. The idea of acquired dignity, that you have to acquire respect. You have to be of certain caste, certain education, certain this and that. So that's why they were not able to translate that into culture the way it should have, the way it is happening in the Western world.
Yeah.
So I think that's the basic underlying thing. So this is a good segue to my next question. So when it comes to our mission to the world today, how much time should we be involving in pre-evangelism? Touching on building the very basic foundation that is necessary before we bring the message that we want to translate into that culture.
I'll start with that. For sure, I think that's prerequisite to evangelism. My position, I know some people will say, I have good friends who say, well, the gospel in itself is powerful. Like literally the words you speak is powerful. And I can see some of that happening, but also God told us to be wise. And we see a lot of the early apostles contextualize the message as, let's say, I know before you in the past, you and I spoke, and you offered this good example between Acts 2 and Acts 17. Why were there a lot of people that accepted Christ in Acts 2 by the simple proclamation of the gospel versus Acts 17, where Paul had to make the case for this unknown God, right? So I think for me, my approach would be you talk about the gospel, you present the gospel again, which is literally good news in its proper context. So you need to understand, let's say, if you go into a people group, you need to understand what their needs are, what their struggles are, what are their hopes and dreams. And then you get into that and offer them the gospel, which ultimately leads to Jesus. I think that's the end goal, is introducing them to Jesus, who is the one who will forgive us of our sins. Because ultimately that's what people are searching for. Mm-hmm. So long answer to saying yes, I think pre-evangelism or knowing the context in which you are sharing the gospel is important.
So let's talk about some strategies.
Yeah.
If there's a church, go ahead.
Okay, let me just jump in just real quick before we go into strategies, because the pre-evangelism is an interesting. You don't want to break it off too much from like almost like a step 1, step 2, and this is why I want to harp back on this morality bit, right? Morality has in its nature a very abstract component, right? You can say love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a very abstract, I wouldn't say necessarily ephemeral, but it's hard to grasp exactly what that means until it is actually applied, and that's what custom builds. What custom does is it facilitates generally a sort of a generally recognizable means to do something. So for let's say like I had high school students be like, Valentine's Day, you need a little rose, and you need to go across the room and give a girl a rose. Now, that is manifesting a particular moral value in a custom that could have been different. You could have picked something else. You could pick a piece of chocolate or something, right? Dances are a perfect example. Like, okay, it is a good thing for guys to know how to interact with girls in some sort of fun, intimate way, but there has to be a way in which you can sort of like have that expectation of like what you need to do and how you're going. It's very stilted. Right? Customs can sometimes be very stilted. A lot of people complain, oh, it's not genuine morality. It's just stilted, process in which, yes, it's exactly what it is. And it facilitates those conversations. I say that because if you have a good view of morality, the customs will change. You need to be able to make that division. Why is that important? When we're talking about, for example, you said with missionaries going to India, there could have been a mistake in which they came in and said, oh, we believe in fundamental human equality. How we have solved this in modern Europe is doing these sorts of things.
Yeah.
And now your customs need to change to fit that mold. When that is not entirely true about the history of Europe. They had their noble class. They had their aristocratic class. They had their divine right monarchy. There are a lot of similarities if you go all the way back to the Aristotelian ethics, to the Confucius Analects, and reading through those. There's similar things going on, and the question is how you divide that. Instead of going and then attacking the customs, you can re-inherit the customs through a fundamental moral shift. And I think that's what the missionaries should be doing, is having a very sophisticated understanding of moral values. You should be able to start with the 10 Commandments. And this is a very fundamental moral view. And then try to use the lessons of the Old Testament and go, okay, when does a custom violate a moral value? And it is very, I wouldn't say it happens in very egregious ways, but it gives you some leeway to show that cultures can flourish with their customs when those moral values are sort of modified or reinvigorated with something that is much more like holistic to the Christian view, who believes in this universal morality.
And it needs to be offered in the context of India, for example, because it's so divided. It needs to be offered in such a way that it is accepted as being valuable by people of all, fractions or sectors.
Yes. And we in Western society, we believe in specialization.
Exactly.
The German history is hyper specialization, and so we do have the resources to go, okay, there are societies that have functioned within the Western tradition, brought Western customs, that are not in so fundamentally dissimilar that there is no point of reference for the Indian customs. We could see hyper specialization, and you could bring in a morale that says, okay, if you're going to have these very specialized societies, then you have moral obligations and duties. If you have a priestly class, like there is a priestly class in the Old Testament, and they had very strict moral values and duties that they had to fulfill. And Christianity can influence that and start there.
What has happened is that in the Indian context, for example, missions have become Christianity is for the undignified. It's called a rice bag Christianity, that people who can't even afford to buy rice are offered rice to convert, right? So it's for the lower caste, it's for people who are underprivileged. And that has really kept a people group away who had power, who had control in terms of like defining the policies and things like. Even today, people who are higher in positions, they're not Christians for that very reason. There's transformation happening at people's level, at the lower caste, but Christianity is also for the pagan, right? Like happy pagan. It's not just for someone who is underprivileged or doesn't have the capacity.
It's for the Solomons, it's for the Davids, it's for the kings, as well as the priests, and as well as the if you want to say lower class, like, and maybe this is where it is, like missionaries. And I don't know, like I haven't spent enough time in like missions to know if there are different strategies or if there are different missions that are set up in different ways. But it seems from what I see from the outside that missions is often viewed, and this is just in the context of Southern California and doing missions in Mexico. It's like we go there, we build houses, we're helping the poor. But there's no missions like, let's go and talk to the assembly members or the parliamentarians in foreign countries and talk to the leaders and say, what needs to happen? You have moral problems. Like, this is why the governments are militarized and they're using the force that they're using. And like, do you do missions work to the elites? I don't know. Maybe that is the case. I'm not.
Definitely, we need to have a shift there in that kind of way of thinking. That's why I say it's not merely a gospel proclamation, but it's a kingdom proclamation. That we are going and preaching the kingdom of God that encapsulates the whole spheres of our existence, including all the domains of
So we're talking about people groups and maybe strategies and ways to proclaim the gospel. So one of the churches we visited in the Philippines, the mega church, I thought it was an interesting focus that this mega church had, and perhaps it's one of the reasons why they are the mega church in the Philippines. So the founding pastor, he had this vision, and he thought no one is reaching the rich, the wealthy. So that's what he did. So he started the church, a Bible study in the economic hub of the Philippines. And from there it grew, and he was reaching the wealthy. And obviously, you can imagine with all of the resources, the church grew tremendously. And right now, I think every Sunday they have about 10,000 people. So that's one example where they are focusing on specific people groups.
So let's come to our home front. Now, Christianity seems to be becoming, or it's already minority religion in the Western world. Whereas we're also seeing a trend of people coming from other worldviews and faith and customs over here, along with a lot of missionaries coming from other parts of the world into the United States, bringing their perspective with regards to how to engage with the world here, this side of the world. So how should we understand missions in light of that? Does global mission hold the same kind of value? Should we continue doing that? Should the churches here in America continue to do global missions? Or should we also focus on missions right in our backyard? How should we think about that?
Well, I think we should do both, no doubt. In Acts, right, when Jesus ascended, there's that famous passage about proclaiming the gospel in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the utter most parts of the earth. And I think that just makes sense to me, even from a economical standpoint, from a practical standpoint. So we do start where we are in our neighborhood, our neighbors, in our local churches. But I think at the same time, there needs to be a focus on the whole going and discipling nations. I think both should be done equally well, in my opinion. So there's always going to be, to quote a famous, author, right? The reason why missions exist is because worship doesn't. Yeah.
John Piper.
Yeah. So we need all of the nations to start worshiping God, worshiping Jesus, and we know in the book of Revelations that all nations, every tribe, every tongue, come together worshiping our Lord. And so we need to have a focus on not only, again, it's much easier to do it locally, and we should be doing that already. Outreaches, we've been doing that, like at Cal State Fullerton. We had a team there go this morning, but also going to international places. And so, yeah.
So, Logan, I may have a specific question for you. The distinction that you, or contrast that you maintain in terms of how cultures are here in the West and get part of the world, and the distinction between morality and customs. So
Yes.
now the way we're seeing the influx of other cultures and worldviews coming into the Western world, here in America as well, what impact do you see is going to happen here now? And also, how should pastors and churches start thinking about that and redeem that which is good, maintain that which is good, and fight for it?
Yeah, there are a few. So there's a few angles on which you could answer that question. I think the best one is to sort of take a step back and go, okay, are customs important for a country? And it seems like when you study civilization, customs are important. And this is why the custom moralization needs to be made known. Because if you go into a country and demolish their customs, you're actually demolishing more than just, you're threatening the moral foundation as well. Because then you're uprooting the customs, and then all you have are these abstract moralities, and then new customs come in, and that's the threat to the existence of these moral virtues that were existing in the country. The United States has a history of customs. And if you read America's founding, they're very clear that even within Western traditions, they said if you took a bunch of American citizens during during the 1700s and 1800s and drop them into France, they would have an existential crisis because they're not a people of the monarchy.
Yeah.
The monarchy would not survive. I mean, it ended up not surviving anyways, but the nature of that people group with its particular customs and its relationship to England at the time and the way it fought the French and the Spanish is that there are kind of dispositions that the customs are taken into consideration that you can drop them into another country to destroy that country, even if it was another Western country. When it comes to the United States, I think pastors need to realize that there are customs that should be defended. Too often they were trapped back to morality. We are just to love our neighbors. It's like, well, what you're falling back is to some sort of abstract reality that doesn't require defense because there's nothing tangible to defend.
Yeah.
As long as people are just loving each other and whatever that may mean, then somehow it's biblical, and that's totally not true. And but there are specific customs to the United States. If it's the way in which we're supposed to vote, like the United States government is structured in such a way that it gives the responsibility, the moral responsibility is handed to the people to give the country accountability.
Yeah.
That should be able to be preached from the pulpit, saying, you guys have a moral duty that is particular in the United States. Like, generally, we have a moral duty to hold people accountable, right? Jesus did this, Paul did this, right? They're holding each other accountable. In the United States, there's a particular way in which we do that. And so how that morality is channeled in the United States is you have to be able to engage in civics. And that is within the foundations. It's not my recommendation. This is the foundations of the United States government, and with its Declaration of Independence, it calls upon its people to do that.
Yeah.
So this would be like kind of a strategy and an answer. When you have other customs coming in, and they're saying we need to return to a monarchy, you should be able to say we don't do monarchies here. Long ago, we had agreed through our Protestant theology. The United States is a very Protestant endeavor, and Roman Catholics, this is why they tend to have a little bit of difficulty. We decided that the power of the king was to be divided into sort of a hydraic government, 3 equal branches. And how those branches function and why they function are customary. And we have to acknowledge the customary, but the customs are unique to the people and they can be defended.
And I think one way to defend that would be to actually connect the roots to the scripture, where from this idea of nationhood derives from. I always say this. I mean, you can't find the idea of nation in Islam. You can't find it in Buddhism or Hinduism. It's found in the Bible. That's what it offers, right? In terms of boundaries, in terms of customs, in terms of how people conduct themselves together as citizens of a nation. So, are you saying that church has to take up the task of also educating in civics? Is that what you're saying, or how are you?
Well,
How should that happen?
Yeah, so there was like 2 steps. The first step is you have to be able to make the distinction between morality and custom, even if it's a synthetic distinction, because they are bound up. When it becomes materialized, they're bound up. But once you're able to make that distinction, you can then see how they're bound up and how they can be defended in certain kinds of ways. Because you read through the Old Testament, a lot of people, and you'll get this in atheistic debates, you'll get this in some bizarre Christian debates where they get bound up in the debate of like, oh, God issued all these laws. Some of them are customs. And God does set up customs for Israel. Israel, you need to do this. You have
For a particular nation, for a particular time.
Yes, particular nation with a particular time, with a particular context and a history and those sorts of things. Like, you're not going to do these things because these things meant something for you in your context, and that needs to be obliterated, and this is how we're going to do it. Same thing with the United States, same thing with France, same thing with India. India will probably have, if it became Christian, would have customs that America would be like, we get the morality part, we get the don't kill the innocent people, we get that theft is wrong, we get that there's a specialization, but there will probably be customs, there may always be customs that were like, we don't necessarily get how that custom came about as maybe a citizen that has not spent time in India, but we understand the distinction and we can cooperate or understand each other despite those extremely unique customs.
So when it comes to missions, we have to be careful then in terms of being generous when it comes to customs. If they do not violate the universal nature of morality that we have been preaching in the gospel.
Yeah, it can't be gross violations of morality.
I want to mention too, in the context of missions, let's say as a missionary, we have to also be sensitive. While, yeah, I agree that there is a way to distinguish between customs and morality, that it might be easy for missionaries to discount the custom just because it's a neutral custom and say, well, the meaning behind it is not that important, or you might say it's unbiblical. Not that it's anti-biblical. It's just a neutral thing. But we have to be careful because it might be they might see it as a sign of disrespect and then be turned off by the gospel message. So to me, while making that distinction, obviously that's important. I would try to hijack their customs and maybe Christianize them if I can. So,
Then you say that everyone's going to look like Americans?
well,
that's
no,
what they
no.
yeah.
So there's a further distinction. There's customs, morality. There's Americanism.
Yeah.
So we don't have to be American while we try to imbue their custom with something more meaningful. Let's say, but maybe even maintain it if it's not unbiblical, or I mean, not anti-biblical. You see what I'm saying? So maintain a particular custom if there's no harm in it. There's no.
No, and I totally agree with you. And that was what I'm getting at with this idea of like, oh well, India is extremely segmented. I mean, there is resources within the Western tradition to understand what a specialization or a segmented society would look like or even function, and you have the resources to do it. And I think you're right that, and this even goes back to the conversation I had about the United States and its history and the disposition of its people. Like, you should probably try to keep as many customs as you can. Like, the goal should be, how do you sort of introduce a very strong view of morality while retaining as many customs as possible.
And Logan, just so you know, I'm not suggesting you were saying destroy all the customs.
Oh, yeah.
Let's start from scratch. Yeah. You were.
No, but no, I think he's right. And I think you said that very clear. Like, maybe
Yeah,
that goes to your strategy is like, and maybe it's not just me. It's like, okay, you should go into a country and you want to preach the gospel. So the prerequisite is you have to have a good understanding of good and evil. Like, what is particularly good, like universally good and universally evil.
Right.
And then when you hit the customs, your strategy should be like, we're going to keep as many customs as possible, unless there's gross violations of what is morally wrong. The only addition I would put to that is there's this sort of sort of like this reasonableness, or we'll say wisdom, in saying like what is actually accomplishable now. And this goes back to even the U.S. founding. Like they sidelined slavery. They put the seeds to abolish slavery in the Declaration. It ends up being used under Lincoln to abolish slavery. But they're like, we cannot abolish it today, but we can put things down
in the process
that will come to hopefully a resolution.
Yeah.
And so that would be so you'd have the morality, keep the customs, and then go, okay, well, some of the immoral customs may just have to stay. Like, if you went by yourself to India and they're practicing, the killing of the wife, and you're like, I'm going to change all of it today. That's probably not going to happen with one missionary. But perhaps you can begin laying the foundations of a morality that would eventually abolish that without.
Right. And I think churches here in the West need to be humble as well, knowing that maybe we should be analyzing and examining our customs too, and see if they appropriate properly with the standards of the scripture.
And that's why it's good to do international missions,
Yes.
because it's also good for the missionary to understand that maybe there are customs that we've held dear but really mean nothing to them, and then you realize, wait, it's a neutral type of a thing.
Yeah. One thing I always say is that the goal of the scriptures or the gospel were not to create a Western civilization. The goal of the scripture is to translate kingdom culture into the nations that it goes to. And it permeates the whole spheres of life.
But as you say that, we have to realize, what does that look like?
Yeah.
Right? What are we, for lack of a better term, you said kingdom culture. Nowadays, that's also Christian nationalism, right?
Yeah.
So how does that really look like? So
a culture that looks more proximate to the values and customs that are created out of that.
Like a fun thought experiment in our conversation could be, so right now, the West, or especially the United States, is the leader in terms of evangelicalism, missionaries, or Christianity. We are the center right now, right? But maybe in a few generations, it could actually be, let's say, China.
Yeah.
What would be a Chinese type of a Christian center look like?
They do have more evangelicals than any other nation.
That's right, exactly. Even more than here, actually. So that would be an interesting thought experiment. What would, and I'm sure it'll be Chinese. They'd be exporting their Chinese values and customs within Christianity. Because I maintain that my assumption is you can't really think of anyone devoid of culture, like we're totally unbiased, we're totally subjective, no such thing. But we try to minimize those kinds of things and recognize our biases, our lack of objectivity. But we're still going to be going as Indian, Filipino, American, whatever, because that's just, and God cares about that actually.
Now, we, especially in the Western world, and I'm saying this as an Easterner, Easterners look within as much as the civilizational goals are outside, as well. But at the same time, I think the West, there's a shift that I'm seeing here in the West. You mentioned Christian nationalism. There's a resurgence of nationalism in the West, and it's translating into many other nations as well around the world. When that happens, what advice would you both give, or what you would have for local churches here, that they may continue this idea of sending missionaries out, which is as much needed as we are talking about, as we need to focus on what God's doing here?
Okay, well, that's obviously easier said than done, right? I feel like I have an advantage a little bit because no one's going to accuse me of colonialism if I'm being a missionary, even short term, somewhere else, right? So just by my looks nowadays, Filipinos are never accused of colonizing anything, right? We've been colonized. So how do we do that? Well, obviously we pray a lot. We're led by the Holy Spirit. But I think it needs to be, we just need to be humble and open about our weaknesses and blind spots and everything. And how can we focus on the biblical message of the gospel? How can we do that to the best of our abilities while maintaining the good customs? I want to say if you're daring, and one should, exposing the bad customs and why it's bad, and introducing godliness to the culture. But that always, we have to remember that that's never devoid of customs, of culture. It has to be inserted, whatever new Christian value they learn. It needs to be inserted into their own context, into their own culture. So the missionary or the church leader needs to really focus on that. That's where the work happens. Obviously, language is one of them. I guess you got to learn the language and you got to learn the culture. So that's why short-term missions, for the most part, I think is good, but it could also be bad because one might argue, are you going there to really evangelize or to preach the gospel, or are you just doing the one-off thing and then, because you're never going to have follow-ups? And then what I don't like is sometimes short-term missions, the mission is to the sending church, not to the location or place you're going to. And that should never be a thing. That's not mission. That's something else. It's a good thing, but we shouldn't be calling that mission. So I think, in my opinion, if any church has a short-term missions program, I think the mission itself has to be really defined. What are you actually going to do? And it has to be long-lasting. It can't just be you go there and it's pretty much, there's no difference between being a tourist and something else.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add, I think what Harry's saying is correct. I think the only thing I would add is when we talk about missions, oftentimes there's always just this concern with Christian nationalism. I think broadly speaking, that term has been coined as like a term of derision. And it's very, I think it's very vacuous, especially in the Western context, especially within the Christian context of its universal morality. It's a word that's trying to be used to do two things. One, either to berate the people they disagree with, if it's evangelicals, if it's Trump supporters, if it's people who disagree with transgender stuff, it's just a term of derision at the local level. And at the global level, the idea of nationalism is becoming a term of derision because what we're seeing is a dissolution of this sort of post-World War II, global order of rules-based decision-making That's falling apart.
Yeah.
And they're trying to use like, oh, nationalism is on the rise as a way to sort of berate countries into being globalists again. And that it's such a vacuous attempt. It's not going to work. There's going to have to be something else. So if you're going to spend your time on maybe the global scale, focusing on things like the rise of nationalism or the rise of Christian nationalism, you're going to find that behind those terms, there's nothing that's substantive. You're going to have to look elsewhere. The questions about morality, the questions about Christianity, the questions about the political discourse in a more substantive way is going to be where you need to focus your time and resources, because that's where you actually need to handle the situation. Other than that, it's mostly political rhetoric, or people who hate conservative church, they will start to Christian nationalism. Well, if there's a Christian morality that translates to Christian nationalism, then deal with the Christian morality instead of just the term. And you have a much more productive, if not conversation, you have a more productive sort of like conception of what is going on that sort of pierces the veil of the discourse. And that's what we really want to get behind, is not the accusation tone, but like, what do the terms actually refer to? What is actually trying to be carved out into what purpose and what end? And you're going to have to get behind that conversation somehow to get to the actual substance of the conversation. It's important for missions because if you get caught up in the Christian nationalism debate, you will fundamentally never get to the conversation of morality versus custom. And that's where you need to get if you're doing missions. What is morality? What is custom? And this goes to Harry's point. Don't get wrapped up on like, okay, what is a custom? What I don't understand. Okay, go to another country. Visit, the friend down the street you've never talked to, and you'll bump into customs left and right. Oh, you do it that way. Oh, you do it that way. That's interesting. Let me think about that. Do that then. Just send people out to random countries and be like, report back with what was strange, and then have a debrief and go like, but okay, why was it strange? Go, oh, well, in Japanese culture, they hand the card with. I noticed that they do the two-hand thing. They do not shake hands. That's a very interesting thing. And then be able to have a conversation about like, okay, is there a moral problem here, or is this like just a thing you just need to like get around? And then having the conversation with the short-term mission. Are we going there to take photo? Is it the photo op? That might be like an immoral situation where you're like posing as helping people,
right.
And you're really it's just posing, right. And that can look different for different cultures. How do different cultures pose? Everyone's posing to some extent in some ways, and how do they do that?
Thank you so much. I know we can continue this and do another episode maybe, and a follow-up
on Christian nationalism. I know. Have you guys done one?
We've done quite a few, at least touching on that very subject. But I just want to say that with missions, what we are reminded again is that we need to focus on the fact that the jurisdiction of the missions is not limited to merely proclamation in terms of like saving someone's soul. It goes beyond that. It informs the whole of the nation and every institution.
And it should be, actually, in my opinion, because the saving of souls, the individual souls, is implied in that.
Yeah.
But the command of our Lord is to disciple nations. So obviously the simple proclamation of Jesus saves, like I said, is part of that. But we should be looking toward our vision should be bigger. We should be looking at government. How do we save government? How do we save the various institutions within the nation? And so going to those leaders, going to those meetings and praying for those things is all, I think, part of the real Great Commission.
Thank you, gentlemen. And this is what we're hoping to do with Kirkwood Center for Ethics and Theology. We're trying to inform all these institutions in doing right kind of theology, understanding God's way of engaging with these institutions. Thank you for all the listeners for taking time to be with us. We want to encourage you to go to our website, kirkwoodcenter.org, and find more resources, including Christian nationalism. We have a lot of podcasts also available on YouTube, on our channel, Kirkwood Center. We look forward to seeing you there. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Theology and Ethics podcast of the Kirkwood Center. Please take a moment to leave a review on your podcast app of choice. If this episode made you think of someone you know, please share it with them. If you want to get in touch with the Kirkwood Center, you can call or text us at 909 493-7799 or send us an email at contact@kirkwoodcenter.org. You can also visit our website at kirkwoodcenter.org. If you want to join the theology and ethics conversation and see more content, you can find the Kirkwood Center on Facebook, Instagram, X, and YouTube and Substack. Until next week, my name is Anthony Costello. Thank you for listening to the Kirkwood Center podcast, and we look forward to hearing from you. Until then, God bless.